The canyon was a frozen echo of silence, broken only by the faint hiss of wind skimming across jagged rocks. Lila Montgomery had come here to escape the suffocating chatter of the town, the whispers about her being too independent, too stubborn, too reckless. She had hoped the night would bring solitude, but instead, it brought a scream that ripped through the darkness. It came from the canyon floor below, a sound that was half human, half the earth cracking. Her heart hammered as she climbed toward it, boots slipping on icy stones. When she reached the source, she froze. A man lay half buried beneath a landslide, his body pressed against jagged rocks. Blood seeped from a gash on his shoulder, mixing with dirt and snow, and his long black hair clung to the frozen mud. His chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. "Help me," he whispered, his voice rough, almost swallowed by the canyon walls. His eyes, dark and wary, flicked up at her, and Lila noticed the subtle flare of fear in them, along with something else, pain and pride. A strange magnetism pulled at her, a sense that saving him wasn't just a choice but a necessity. She dropped to her knees, brushing snow from his face and digging at the stones pinning him. The sharp edges cut her palms, but she ignored the sting. She didn't have much time. The temperature was dropping fast, and she could feel the chill seeping into his body. With a grunt, she shifted a large rock, finally freeing his torso. He groaned but didn't resist. There was strength in him, even in his weakness, and she marveled at it. "Careful," she whispered, voice trembling despite her attempt at calm. "I've got you." He nodded slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied her. She saw a tattoo peeking from beneath his torn shirt, a tribal symbol inked into his skin. It was intricate, delicate, yet bold, like the man himself. Lila had seen tattoos before, but nothing like this. She didn't understand its meaning yet, but somehow she knew it mattered. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon like a chorus of angry spirits. Snow whipped against her face, stinging her cheeks. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and grabbed his arm, helping him to his feet. His weight was heavy, but not unbearable, and together they stumbled toward the ridge where she had left her horse. Every step was a battle. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and Lila felt the bite of panic as she imagined leaving him behind. "You're going to make it," she murmured, more to convince herself than him. But he didn't respond, only leaning on her shoulder, silent and watchful. Finally, they reached her horse. She loosened the straps of her pack, piling blankets and a few supplies onto the animal, then hoisted him carefully into the saddle. He winced, but didn't speak, his eyes scanning the canyon like he expected danger at every turn. Lila climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms around his chest to steady him. The smell of blood and cold sweat mingled with the pine-scented winter air, and her stomach twisted in uneased as they rode toward her cabin. The moonlight painted the canyon in shades of silver and gray. Shadows clung to the rocks like ghosts, and the wind carried the faint sound of distant howls, wolves maybe, or just the canyon playing tricks. Lila couldn't tell anymore. All she knew was that this man, this stranger with long black hair and wary eyes, needed her. And she couldn't turn away by the time they reached the cabin. She was shivering from cold and exertion, but she didn't notice. She unloaded him gently, laying him on the floor and covering him with blankets. He groaned, a low, guttural sound, and his eyes fluttered closed. Lila lit a fire, the flames cracking and spitting sparks, and felt a strange, hollow relief as warmth began to fill the cabin. She sat beside him, watching the firelight dance across his bruised and battered face. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why, in a world that had refused him, did fate lead him to her? The answer, she knew, would reveal itself slowly. But one thing was certain. Everyone else had abandoned him, yet she wouldn't. Not tonight. Not ever. The ruins of the old trading post crouched at the canyon's edge like a skeleton of some long-forgotten past. Charred timbers jutted at odd angles, and the stone walls, blackened by fire, were crumbling under the relentless bite of winter. Lila had guided Takoda here after the long ride from the landslide. She needed shelter that the wind and snow couldn't pierce. The canyon floor was icy, the wind slicing through her coat and biting her face with cruel precision, but inside the ruins, she felt a fragile sense of safety. Takoda lay on a pile of tattered blankets she had scavenged from her pack. His chest rose and fell unevenly, and Lila pressed her gloved hands to his cuts, trying to clean them with water she had heated over a small, trembling fire. His skin was pale, almost ghostly in the flickering light, and the wounds along his arms and torso were deep enough to chill her to the bone. She worked quietly, careful not to startle him. His eyes, dark and wide, followed every motion, a flicker of gratitude hidden beneath layers of pain and weariness. "You survive?" she asked softly, brushing a strand of black hair from his face. He didn't answer in words but offered a slow, almost imperceptible nod. His expression was unreadable, yet in it she sensed trust beginning to grow. Outside, the wind howled like the voices of restless spirits, rattling the skeletal walls. Lila piled stones around the small fire, making a crude windbreak. Sparks danced in the air, casting long shadows across Takoda's taut muscles, revealing the tribal tattoos etched into his chest and shoulders. They were intricate patterns, symbols she didn't understand, but they seemed to tell a story of strength, honor, and survival. She traced her fingers along the lines absent-mindedly, feeling the raised edges of ink scars and imagining the battles they represented. Hours passed. Takoda's breathing steadied slightly, and Lila felt a fragile sense of victory. She studied him, noting the way his hands flexed, the tautness in his limbs even when he was at his weakest. He was a man accustomed to pain and hardship, yet here he was, alive. She couldn't help but admire him not just for his resilience, but for the quiet dignity that radiated from him, even in his current vulnerability. A sudden movement outside made her start. Shadows shifted across the ruins, thrown by the fire and the moonlight. Lila's hand went instinctively to the small revolver at her side, but it was only a fox darting across the snow, its red fur aflash against white. She exhaled, tension leaving her in a shiver. The canyon was alive with unseen dangers, predators, cold, and men who would not forgive Takoda's past, but inside these ruins, she felt the first flicker of hope in days. Takoda shifted. Groaning softly, and for the first time, he reached for her hand. His fingers were rough, scarred, and trembling, yet the gesture was unambiguous, a silent plea for trust, for care, for companionship. Lila squeezed his hand in return, a silent promise. No one had chosen to save him before. Most would have let him die in the canyon, but she had. She would not abandon him now. As night deepened, the temperature dropped further. Lila layered more blankets over him and her own shoulders, then sat close to the fire, keeping one eye on the dark canyon outside. She remembered the town's judgmental whispers, the way neighbors would have turned away if they knew she had rescued a so-called savage. But those voices felt distant now, insignificant compared to the life she was holding in her hands. Finally, Takoda's eyes closed. Sleep took him despite the pain, the flickering firelight casting a warm glow across his features. Lila watched him for a long while, heart aching with a mix of fear and something deeper, something protective she couldn't name. She whispered softly into the silence, "You're safe. For now." Outside, the wind raged and the snow fell in relentless sheets. But inside the ruined trading post, two unlikely allies had found a fragile sanctuary. Lila knew the dangers were far from over. Men hunted Takoda. The wilderness itself could kill them, but for tonight she had given him life. And in giving him life, she had begun to discover something in herself she hadn't known existed: courage, compassion, and a stubborn refusal to leave the helpless behind. The fire crackled and sputtered, casting flickering light on the walls. Shadows danced across Takoda's sleeping face, and Lila allowed herself a small, private smile. Somehow, against all odds, the canyon had led them to each other, and perhaps, together, they could survive whatever came next. The next morning, Lila woke to a brittle silence, broken only by the occasional groan of Takoda as he shifted under the blankets. His chest rose and fell steadily now, but the deep gash along his shoulder had scabbed unevenly, and bruises colored his skin in shades of violet and green. She needed water-clean water, but the stream near her cabin had been tainted by a logjam, the current carrying murky brown sludge and dead fish. Drinking from it would have meant poisoning him. She wrapped a scarf around her face and mounted her horse, Takoda leaning heavily on her as they set out along a narrow canyon trail. The path was jagged, littered with loose stones and frozen debris, but Lila knew the land. She guided him carefully, feeling the rhythm of his labored breathing against her back. Every step was a reminder that survival was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, and failure meant death. As they walked, the canyon seemed alive with danger. A sudden rattle of snakes startled Lila, and she jumped back just as a pair of copper-colored rattlers slithered across the trail, tongues flicking. Takoda tensed beside her, his muscles coiling instinctively. She could feel the raw strength in him, even when weakened, and she knew he could handle the threat, but she refused to let him face it alone. With a sharp rock, she struck at the snakes, and they recoiled, retreating into the brush. Hours passed. The canyon walls narrowed, and a low thunderstorm rolled over the peaks, lightning spiking the gray sky and scattering snow across the trail. Takoda's movements grew sluggish, and she realized he was fighting a hidden fever. She supported him, tying him to her horse with a thick blanket for stability, and pressed on through the mud and ice, sweat mingling with snowflakes on her skin. Her arms ached, but she ignored it. His life depended on her endurance. Finally, she spotted the abandoned miner's reservoir in a hollow between cliffs. Rusted pipes jutted from the frozen edges, and the shallow water was clear enough for Takoda to drink after she boiled it with remnants of firewood. She knelt beside him, letting him sip slowly, brushing back damp strands of hair that clung to his forehead. He studied her silently, the dark intensity in his eyes softening ever so slightly. She could sense a quiet gratitude, not in words, but in the way his tense body relaxed against her touch. While Takoda rested, Lila scouted the area, checking for predators and signs of other travelers. The storm had driven most wildlife into hiding, but the canyon was unpredictable. She found footprints near the reservoir human, likely bounty hunters or settlers who would not forgive Takoda's presence in the land. She clenched her jaw, feeling the familiar stir of fear and determination. Everyone had refused to save him, but she wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. As night fell, she built a small fire using dry driftwood and bark, careful not to draw attention. The flames cast flickering shadows over Takoda's resting form, highlighting the contours of his muscular torso and the intricate tribal tattoos on his chest and shoulders. Lila wrapped more blankets around him, pressing her gloved hands to his fevered forehead. "You'll be all right," she whispered, though even she didn't know if the words were true. They huddled close for warmth, the night cold pressing through the thin walls of her makeshift shelter. Lila could feel the pulse of life beneath her hands, steadying gradually as Takoda's breathing deepened. The sound was rhythmic, almost meditative, a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting. Outside, the wind whipped through the canyon, carrying distant echoes of wildlife and the faint rumble of rocks shifting in the cliffs above. Danger surrounded them on every side, Yet inside this fragile sanctuary, a bond had begun to form. Takoda's eyes opened briefly, catching hers in the firelight, and she saw trust there, a fragile, tentative thread, but trust nonetheless. For the first time since she had found him beneath the landslide, Lila allowed herself to feel hope. The world outside was still dangerous, the town still judgmental, and the hunters still relentless, but here, in this poison canyon, she had given him life again. And for Takoda, it was more than survival. It was proof that someone had chosen him when no one else would. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the night, illuminating the canyon walls in warm orange and shadowed gray. Lila sat back, brushing snow from her coat, and whispered into the wind, "We'll survive this. Together." And somewhere deep in Takoda's steady breathing, she felt the silent answer, yes, they would. The town of Red Ridge never looked smaller than it did from the crest of the canyon trail. Lila Montgomery tightened her cloak around her shoulders and led Takoda down the winding path, her heart thudding like a drum. Supplies were low: blankets, dried meat, and bandages. She had hoped to make it back without attracting attention, but she knew the townsfolk would notice a man like Takoda. His presence was dangerous, not just to him, but to her. As they approached the edge of town, a cold silence greeted them. Windows shuttered, doors bolted, and the occasional flicker of candlelight revealed faces pressed against glass, staring. Murmurs rose as they passed. "It's him? The savage. Why would she shelter him? They should leave them both to the wolves." Lila's jaw clenched. Every eye on them carried judgment and fear, but she did not flinch. She had saved him once, and she would do it again. She guided Takoda to the loft above her barn. The ladder creaked under their weight, and the shadows of hay bales and old tools created strange shifting shapes across the walls. Lila secured the loft door, then lit a small lantern. The firelight flickered across Takoda's muscular form, the contours of his chest and shoulders highlighted, and the tribal tattoos etched into his skin seemed almost to glow in the dim light. He leaned back, exhausted but alert, eyes scanning every corner of the room. "Stay quiet," she whispered, placing a hand on his arm. He nodded, understanding her perfectly without words. Communication between them had grown beyond speech. Gestures, glances, and subtle movements carried meaning. Lila felt a mix of fear and admiration. He was still a stranger, yet he trusted her completely. Outside, the wind rattled the barn roof, and the town below seemed eerily still, as if holding its breath. Lila knew that her neighbors would not approve of her harboring an Apache warrior. Many would have offered no help, some would have hunted him themselves. But she ignored the whispers. Their survival was all that mattered. Night fell, and the barn became a sanctuary from both the bitter cold and prying eyes. Takoda shifted uncomfortably, his body stiff from the days of travel, snow, and exhaustion. Lila gathered hay to make a softer bed beneath him and wrapped him in layers of blankets. She knelt beside him, brushing snow and grime from his long black hair. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and he closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her hands as though seeking comfort he had never known. For hours, she tended to him, checking the healing of his shoulder wound and bandaging small scrapes. She noticed how each scar and tattoo told a story of survival and identity, each marking a memory she could only guess at. In the dim light of the lantern, Takoda's chest rose and fell steadily, his dark eyes occasionally flicking open to meet hers. She could sense his unspoken question, "Why are you helping me when no one else would?" Lila's lips pressed together, and she shook her head slightly. A silent answer, "Because you deserve it." The night stretched long and quiet, punctuated only by the occasional howl of a distant wolf or the rattle of loose shutters in the wind. Lila felt the weight of responsibility pressing against her chest, but she also felt something new resolve. She would protect him no matter the risk, even if it meant standing against the entire town. Suddenly, a noise outside snapped her attention to the window, a shadow moving among the alleyways, a figure watching the barn. Lila's hand went instinctively to her revolver, and she motioned for Takoda to stay low. He mirrored her caution, crouching beside the hay bales, muscles coiled and ready despite exhaustion. The figure lingered, then retreated into the night, leaving only the echo of footsteps. Lila exhaled slowly, keeping her eyes on the dark street below. The town's judgment was unavoidable, but its dangers could be managed. With Takoda by her side, she felt stronger, capable of facing the whispers, the glares, and the threats. He was not just a man she had saved. He was an ally, a protector, and perhaps the first person in a long time who understood the courage it took to do the right thing. She glanced at him, silhouetted by firelight and lantern glow, and realized that trust had been forged in silence, in shared danger, and in the quiet moments of care. The town might call him a savage, and they might refuse him help. But here, in the loft above her barn, Lila had given him something far more important than life itself, a place where he belonged. At least for tonight. The wind sighed through the cracks in the walls, carrying a promise of storms to come. Lila placed a reassuring hand on his arm, whispering softly, "No one can touch you here. Not while I'm around." Takoda's hand brushed hers in response, a silent vow of understanding. In that moment, they were no longer just rescuer and rescued, they were partners in survival. Bound by courage, trust, and the unspoken knowledge that together, they could face whatever the world might throw at them. The canyon seemed alive with danger that morning. The rhythmic rumble of an approaching train echoed off the stone cliffs, vibrations humming through the ground beneath Lila's boots. She had never seen a train move so fast, so determined, yet. It carried more than supplies, it carried hunters who had tracked Takoda for miles. Lila tightened her grip on his arm as they crested a ridge, the rails glinting in the weak morning sun, a thin layer of frost clinging to each steel spike. "Careful," she whispered. Takoda's dark eyes scanned the tracks below, muscles tensed despite his lingering weakness. He had survived landslides, snowstorms, and poisoned streams, yet the thought of men pursuing him on a speeding train seemed to unsettle even him. Lila guided him down the slope, her boots slipping on the icy dirt, and he leaned heavily on her shoulder, trusting her guidance without hesitation. The train roared closer, steam curling like ghostly tendrils into the sky. Lila spotted empty boxcars ahead, partially open, and a plan formed in her mind. They had no time to think, only to act. With a few whispered words and a careful balance, she helped Takoda to a low embankment. They moved as silently as the snow allowed, every snap of a branch underfoot echoing like a gunshot. Reaching the boxcars, Lila found one that had derailed slightly, creating a narrow gap just wide enough for them to slip inside. She pushed the door open, and they climbed in, the interior dark and smelling of old wood and iron. Takoda lay flat on the floor, chest rising and falling, while Lila blocked the doorway, peering out at the train as it thundered past. Sparks flew from the rails where metal met ice, and she could hear the shouts of men trying to locate them. "You'll be all right?" she murmured, brushing a strand of snow-damp hair from his forehead. He gave her a slow nod, his dark eyes meeting hers with something unspoken trust, gratitude, and the knowledge that she had kept him alive against impossible odds. The train rattled and groaned, each jolt sending ice-cold gusts through the open doorway. Lila adjusted their position, ensuring they stayed low and unseen. Outside, the canyon cliffs blurred past, the wind carrying the faint scent of smoke from the engine. She could feel the pulse of danger in every vibration, but she refused to panic. She had saved him once. She would do it again. Suddenly, a shout rang from above. Men on horseback, trying to intercept the train and corner them. Lila's heart raced. She grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and wedged it against the door, creating a crude barricade. Takoda, though weak, shifted to help, his arms coiling with barely contained strength. They moved together, a rhythm of survival forged over days of trust and shared peril. The boxcar lurched violently, ice scraping against metal, and Lila instinctively pressed herself against Takoda's back. The warmth of his body was a strange comfort, grounding her in the chaos. Outside, the horsemen shouted, guns raised, but the train's speed and the treacherous canyon terrain kept them at bay. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the train slowed as it approached a curve in the canyon, and the men on horseback fell behind, unable to match the momentum. Lila let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Takoda exhaled. Beside her, eyes closing briefly as relief flickered across his features. When the train finally crested a ridge and the boxcar swayed less violently, Lila allowed herself a moment to observe him. Muscles coiled beneath tanned, scarred skin, tribal tattoos catching the dim light. Long black hair clinging damp to his shoulders. A man of survival, yet still human, still vulnerable. She felt a swell of pride and protectiveness. Against landslides, poisoned streams, townsfolk, and relentless hunters, he had survived. And she had kept him alive. The train continued its journey through the snowy canyon, a steel serpent winding through cliffs and frozen rivers. Lila pressed a hand to Takoda's shoulder. "We're not safe yet," she whispered, "but we're alive." He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, his dark eyes meeting hers once again. In that gaze, she saw a shared understanding. No matter what the world threw at them next, they would face it together. As the boxcar rattled on, the wind howling outside, Lila realized that survival was more than escaping danger. It was finding strength, trust, and courage in places she never imagined. And in Takoda, she had found all three, bound by a bond forged in the frozen, perilous heart of the canyon. By the time Lila and Takoda left the canyon behind, the landscape had shifted into an open desert of baked earth, jagged rock formations, and relentless sun. The wind carried grit and dust that stung Lila's cheeks, and the heat pressed down with a weight that made every step feel like walking through molten stone. Takoda, still recovering from the wounds, leaned heavily on her arm, his shirtless torso glistening with sweat, the tribal tattoos on his shoulders and chest vivid under the sun. The desert seemed merciless, but Lila had learned to read the land. She led him toward a small wash where she hoped to find some shade, water, or at least a reprieve from the scorching sun. Takoda stumbled, and she caught him, steadying him with one strong arm while shielding him from the wind with her body. "We can't stop yet," she whispered, her throat dry, her legs aching, but determination burning in her chest. "Just a little farther." The sun climbed higher, and heat waves shimmered above the sand, creating mirages of water pools that vanished when approached. Takoda's breathing grew shallow, and Lila realized that the fever he had fought earlier had returned with a vengeance. She guided him under the sparse shade of a jagged rock overhang and knelt beside him, checking his pulse and brushing sweat-drenched strands of black hair from his face. "I've got herbs," she murmured, pulling dried bundles from her satchel sage, yarrow, and a brittle piece of desert aloe. She crushed them into a poultice and applied it carefully to his fevered skin, murmuring soft reassurances as Takoda's eyes tracked her movements. Though he said nothing, the slightest nod or flicker of his dark eyes told her he trusted her completely. As the afternoon sun blazed overhead, Lila set to work finding small sources of nourishment, wild cacti that had not yet turned bitter, and small desert berries that clung stubbornly to thorny bush. She crushed them into a paste and coaxed Takoda to eat slowly. He obeyed, his body trembling but his strength returning gradually. She marveled at his resilience, the same strength that had carried him through landslides, snowstorms, poisoned streams, and hunters now carried him through the desert dot as night fell. The desert transformed into a world of stark shadows and silver light. The stars were blinding in their clarity, stretching endlessly across the sky. Lila built a small fire, careful not to let smoke reveal their location, and the warmth brought a sense of comfort neither had felt in days. Takoda lay beside her, muscles tense but gradually relaxing, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. She traced the contours of his tattoos in the dim glow, fascinated by the stories etched into his skin, tribal symbols of strength, honor, and survival. "Your people," she whispered, feeling the urge to understand him more, though words often failed between them. Takoda tilted his head, a slow exhale conveying something beyond speech. Memories of home, battles, lost families, and sacred lands. She listened in silence, letting the desert night and the crackle of the fire hold their unspoken conversation. Sleep finally claimed Takoda, and Lila watched him carefully, ensuring he remained safe. The desert was unforgiving wolves, rattlesnakes, and the ever-present threat of bounty hunters, but in that quiet, starlit moment, she realized something profound. Survival was more than escaping danger. It was trust, courage, and companionship. She had saved him once. Now she had saved him again. And in the process, she had discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the rocky outcrop, and the night air cooled against their skin. Lila rested her hand lightly on Takoda's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, protection, and unspoken understanding. He responded with a subtle squeeze of her hand, a silent promise that together they would endure whatever came next. Somewhere in the vast desert, under a sky of infinite stars, two souls, one warrior. One woman found a fragile sanctuary. The world outside might still be hostile, but here, in the heart of the wilderness, they had found trust, resilience, and the courage to face what was to come. The wind carried the scent of dust, sweat, and the distant smoke of Red Ridge. Lila Montgomery led Takoda carefully down a hidden trail, the canyon walls narrowing as they approached the outskirts of town. For days, they had survived landslides, snowstorms, poisoned streams, relentless hunters, and a merciless desert. Now the final challenge awaited, the town itself, whose suspicion and fear had rejected him at every turn. Takoda's chest rose and fell steadily, his muscular torso gleaming under the late afternoon sun, tattoos tracing the story of a lifetime filled with survival, honor, and struggle. Though weakened from their journey, his dark eyes burned with determination. Lila felt a swell of pride and protectiveness. Everyone had abandoned him before, but she had never wavered. "Stay close," she whispered, gripping his arm. He nodded, silent but attentive, muscles coiled and ready. The streets of Red Ridge were unnervingly quiet, doors bolted, and windows shuttered. Shadows stretched long across the wooden sidewalks, the occasional flicker of movement hinting at the town's watchful inhabitants. Whispers followed them. "It's him. The savage. She shouldn't be helping him." The town marshal stepped forward, revolver drawn, his expression a mix of authority and contempt. "Lila, what in God's name?" he began. But Lila cut him off. "He's not your enemy," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "He's been hunted, abandoned, and left to die. I saved him, and I won't let anyone harm him while I'm here." The marshal's eyes narrowed, scanning Takoda, whose presence radiated strength and quiet defiance. He didn't speak, but the weight of his gaze was enough to silence the room. Some townsfolk whispered in fear, others in awe. Lila's heart pounded as she realized the moment of truth had arrived. Suddenly, A group of hunters emerged from the alleyways, rifles raised, intending to claim the bounty that had followed Takoda across deserts and canyons. Lila stepped forward, blocking Takoda's path. "You won't touch him," she declared. "Not while I stand here." The hunters laughed, but Takoda moved with a speed and power that belied his weakened state. Muscles coiled, arms swinging. In precise arcs, as he disarmed the nearest man with a single fluid motion. Dust rose around their boots, and the town seemed to hold its collective breath. Lila's eyes widened, but she stood her ground, ready to defend him alongside him. Takoda's dark gaze swept over the townsfolk. The fear and judgment that had haunted him for weeks gave way to something else: pride, resolve, and recognition that he was not alone. Lila had chosen him when no one else would, and now he would protect her and himself with everything he had left. The hunters faltered, their confidence shaken by the warrior's presence. One by one, they lowered their weapons, retreating under the intensity of Takoda's silent warning. The marshal, still uneasy, stepped forward and finally nodded. "He's yours to protect," he said. Conceding the truth Lila had already proven Dot as the sun dipped below the horizon. Painting Red Ridge in shades of gold and crimson, the town watched in awe. Lila stood beside Takoda, a hand resting lightly on his arm, a symbol of solidarity and trust. He looked at her, dark eyes meeting hers, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. They had survived, together. The streets emptied, but the whispers of respect replaced the murmurs of fear. Takoda's chest rose and fell with steady breaths, his tattoos glowing faintly in the fading light, each marking a story of survival, courage, and honor. Lila realized that she had not just saved a man, she had restored dignity, fought prejudice, and found a bond that would endure beyond the trials of canyon, desert, and town. That night, as stars blanketed the sky above Red Ridge, they sat together atop a ridge overlooking the town. The wind carried the scent of pine and dust, and the distant howl of wolves reminded them of the wild world they had conquered together. Takoda reached out, brushing Lila's hair from her face, a silent gesture of gratitude and trust. She returned it, their fingers entwining a promise that no force, no fear could break. For the first time, both of them allowed themselves to believe in a future beyond survival. The canyon, the desert, the hunters, they had faced it all. But now together, they were stronger than any obstacle. Lila Montgomery had chosen to save him when everyone else refused, and in doing so, they had discovered something greater than life itself: trust, courage, and the unbreakable bond forged in fire, snow, and sand. The night deepened, shadows stretching long across the town, but atop the ridge, a warrior and the woman who saved him found peace. In each other, they had found home.